Hello and welcome. Tonight we're going to take a calm, slow journey back to London in the 1660s. So let yourself relax while I take you back in time to the Great Fire that completely reshaped the city. London, September 1666. The city was a tangled maze of narrow, winding streets and timber-framed houses, still slowly recovering from the Great Plague of the previous year. Life had begun to return to its usual rhythm. Markets bustled with merchants, taverns echoed with conversation, and the streets were alive with people going about their day. The air carried a mixture of scents: smoke from hearths, the faint tang of the river, and the less pleasant reminders of a city still learning how to manage its waste. Wooden houses leaned close together, so near that neighbours could almost reach across the street to greet each other. Straw roofs and open flames added a gentle glow at night, though they also reminded everyone of the city's fragility. It was a lively, busy place, a little untidy and often smelly, but full of energy and character. This was London then, a city of movement and life, brimming with stories waiting to unfold. The fire began in the early hours of Sunday the 2nd of September 1666 in a small bakery on Pudding Lane. It belonged to Thomas Farriner, the King's baker, a man whose mornings usually began with bread and ovens, rather than alarm and chaos. A stray spark from the oven, left smouldering overnight, found something flammable nearby, perhaps a heap of flour, kindling, or firewood, and before anyone could stop it, the bakery was alight. Timber walls, straw roofs, and tar-filled floors meant the flames spread quickly, and the house soon became a roaring blaze. The family escaped by jumping to the neighbouring building, though sadly the maidservant, too frightened to leap, became the first victim of the fire. Neighbours tried bravely to put out the flames, but it was a losing battle. Parish constables arrived an hour later, suggesting that nearby houses be demolished to halt the spread. The homeowners were reluctant, so the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was called to make the decision. By the time he arrived, strong winds had carried the flames from house to house, reaching warehouses along the river full of flammable goods. Experienced firemen urged for demolitions, but Bloodworth hesitated. Most of the buildings were rented, and their owners could not be found. In a moment that history has often remembered, he famously remarked that a woman might piss it out before leaving the scene, hoping someone else would manage the growing inferno. Though it's easy to imagine blaming him, the truth is that firefighting at the time was uncertain at best. Decisions were difficult, knowledge was limited, and chaos was inevitable. The fire was spreading, and the city had little choice but to watch and hope that what came next could be contained. In 17th century London, fires were as familiar as the chatter of the streets or the occasional waft of smoke from a chimney. The city was a tightly packed maze of timber-framed buildings, open hearths and candles, with plenty of flammable materials tucked into every corner. To keep watch over the streets, around 1,000 watchmen, known as bellmen, patrolled at night, listening for the warning ring of the church bells. If a fire broke out, neighbours would gather, ready with buckets, ladders, and anything else that might help. Firefighting then was more about courage than efficiency. The usual plan was to pour water on the flames, and if that failed, to pull down the buildings to stop the fire from spreading. Every parish kept a stash of ladders, buckets and hooks for emergencies, and in the worst cases, buildings were deliberately demolished to protect their neighbours. London was lucky to have a clever network of elm pipes supplying water from a tower at Cornhill and a reservoir in Islington. A bucket chain from the Thames could, in theory, have helped douse the flames, but when the fire began, panic spread faster than the smoke. People fled rather than organised themselves, and when the flames reached the river, they even threatened the water wheels under London Bridge, cutting off the supply. There were also early fire engines, large pumps designed to save the day. Some had wheels, while others were mounted on sleds, which made navigating the cobbled streets slow and awkward. A few brave souls tried to use them, only for some engines to accidentally end up in the river. By the time the pumps were recovered, the fire had already taken hold, spreading quickly and consuming the city's tightly packed wooden buildings. As the morning unfolded, the fire grew stronger. At 7 a.m. on Sunday, Samuel Pepys, London's ever-curious neighbour and devoted diary keeper, climbed the Tower of London for a better view of the disaster. From his lofty vantage point, he could see the east winds whipping the flames into a fierce firestorm. Already, around 300 homes had been consumed, and even the houses on London Bridge were beginning to burn. Eager to see the scene more closely, Pepys rowed across to Pudding Lane. People were hurriedly loading belongings into boats, while others stayed behind, too frightened to move, until the flames were almost at their doors. One baker rescued a loaf tin, a neighbour fussed over a cat perched on a windowsill, and a father guided his child through the smoke, holding them tightly. Even amongst all the chaos, small acts of care continued quietly alongside the panic. Bursting with news, Pepys rowed west along the Thames to Whitehall and delivered the unfolding story to the royal court. King Charles II, keen to understand the situation, summoned Pepys to hear the news firsthand. Pepys explained clearly that unless buildings were pulled down, the fire would continue its relentless march. Alarmed, the king sent Pepys straight to the Lord Mayor with orders to demolish anything in the fire's path, and his brother, James, Duke of York, offered the Royal Lifeguards to help. At the mayor's office, Pepys found Sir Thomas Bloodworth in a state of nervous indecision. He lamented that the fire overtakes us faster than we can do it, and declined additional help before retreating to bed. By the time the king himself had sailed down the Thames to inspect the scene, full-scale demolitions were underway, as Charles took direct action to protect the city. Meanwhile, Pepys attended to a matter of personal importance. Concerned for his treasured cheese and wine, he buried them in his garden to keep them safe from the fire. He later recovered them, unharmed, much to the relief of his appetite, and to the disappointment, perhaps, to future archaeologists. By this time, the fire was roaring so fiercely that many Londoners had given up trying to fight it and decided that running to safety was the wiser choice. The streets became crowded with people hastily gathering carts, bundles, pets, and perhaps even the occasional chicken, making it difficult for firemen to reach the flames. By Sunday afternoon, the fire had already travelled some 500 metres west along the river, earning itself the title of most damaging fire to strike London in living memory. It continued to burn through Monday, moving west and north as though exploring the city on its own little tour. The River Thames helped protect the south, while a gap between buildings on London Bridge acted as a natural fire break. stopping the flames from spreading into Southwark. Up north, the fire had reached Lombard Street by 10 a.m, home to the city's bankers. Panic spread quickly as they hurried to save their coins and valuables before they were lost to the flames. Across the city, Londoners moved in a jumble of confusion, worry and frantic activity, many unsure of how to protect their homes or their belongings. As the flames crept towards the more fashionable parts of town, Cheapside's luxury shops and the Royal Exchange, the 1600s equivalent of a very fancy shopping mall, were not spared. By the afternoon, the Royal Exchange was reduced to a charred shell, leaving onlookers standing in shock. John Evelyn, another diarist of the time, recorded that people seemed so overwhelmed by the unfolding events that they ran about in tears, unable to save much beyond the things they could carry. It was a day of immense destruction, and the fire was only just beginning. As the fire continued to spread, so did whispers that it might not be entirely accidental. Strong winds carried sparks and burning fragments across the city, setting alight thatched roofs and wooden gutters in places that hadn't yet seen flames. Naturally, these unexpected blazes gave rise to a host of rumours, with neighbours speculating wildly about how the fire had started. Stories grew in the retelling, suggesting all manner of mischief. People claimed to have seen suspicious figures carrying strange objects or setting small fires deliberately. The excitement and fear stirred tension in the streets as Londoners tried to make sense of the chaos around them. In amongst the smoke and panic, imagination and gossip spread almost as quickly as the flames themselves. As the flames continued their march, the wealthier residents grew increasingly anxious to rescue their most treasured belongings, everything from silverware and silk gowns to portraits of ancestors staring solemnly from gilded frames. Their hurried departures created an unexpected opportunity for the able-bodied poor, who quickly became impromptu helpers, ferrying goods by cart or boat. Anyone with a strong pair of legs, a cart or a boat, suddenly found themselves in high demand. Just a week before, a cart could be rented for a few shillings, but by Monday, prices had allegedly soared to £40, a small fortune at the time. Every available cart and boat seemed to appear from nowhere, leading to gridlock at the city gates. The chaos grew so intense that around 3 p.m, magistrates ordered the gates temporarily closed, perhaps hoping that with no escape route, people might pause long enough to help tackle the fire. The plan had mixed results, but at least some order was beginning to emerge. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, meanwhile, seemed to have disappeared, leaving the city without its usual leadership. King Charles II stepped in, handing command to his brother, James, the Duke of York. The Duke quickly took charge, setting up command posts around the edges of the fire and appointing teams of courtiers with authority to begin demolishing buildings to halt the flames. One impressed observer wrote that, "The Duke hath won the hearts of the people with his tireless efforts." Even so, not everything could be saved. That evening, hopeful eyes turned to the great stone walls of Baynard's Castle, a western cousin of the Tower of London. Despite everyone's hopes, the historic palace could not withstand the fire and burned through the night, a reminder of the city's vulnerability and the immense scale of the disaster. Tuesday, the 4th of September, proved to be the most destructive day of the Great Fire. The Duke of York had established his command post at Temple Bar where Fleet Street meets the Strand, with hopes of making a heroic stand along the River Fleet, intending to use the river as a natural firebreak. Early that morning, as the Duke and his teams prepared for action, the flames leapt over the river, ignoring the planned barrier. The firefighters were forced to retreat, unable to stop the fire's relentless advance. By lunchtime, the fire had reached Ludgate and Newgate, destroying the prisons there. It then began moving east, against the wind, aiming for the Tower of London, which held a considerable store of gunpowder. With the official firefighting teams still occupied in the west, the Tower garrison took matters into their own hands. They carefully demolished houses to create fire breaks, and their efforts successfully halted the eastward advance of the flames. Elsewhere, the fire had turned its attention to St. Paul's Cathedral. The thick stone walls and the open square surrounding it had seemed a natural safeguard, and many people had placed their rescued belongings inside. The crypts were filled with books and papers from nearby printers and booksellers of Paternoster Row. Unfortunately, the cathedral was undergoing renovations under Christopher Wren and was wrapped in wooden scaffolding. By evening, the scaffolding had caught fire, and within half an hour, the lead on the roof had melted, leaving St. Paul's a smouldering ruin. By Tuesday evening, the winds finally began to ease, and the fire breaks the Tower garrison had been desperately creating began to hold. By Wednesday the 5th of September, things were slightly less chaotic. Samuel Pepys climbed the steeple of Barking Church for a better view and recorded the moment as the saddest sight of desolation that I ever saw. A fair description, considering how much of the city had been reduced to ash. A few fires still smouldered, but the worst of the blaze was over. The clean-up, however, would be slow and painstaking. Some coal in cellars continued to burn for another 2 months, quietly reminding everyone of the fire's lingering presence. Up in Moorfields, the large open park just north of the city, thousands of Londoners who had lost everything had gathered. Some had small tents, others had built makeshift shelters from scraps of wood and cloth, and some had nothing at all. It was a grim and crowded scene, full of exhaustion and uncertainty. Worries and rumours still swirled. That Wednesday night, a mysterious light over Fleet Street sparked panic. Stories quickly spread that 50,000 foreign invaders were marching on Moorfields, intent on looting and violence. Terrified residents surged into the streets, attacking anyone who even appeared to be foreign. Chaos reigned until the trained bands, the lifeguards, and a few courtiers intervened and restored some order. In the end, the lights in the sky were nothing more than another flare-up of the fire near Inner Temple. Attempts to stop it by demolishing Paper House were only partially successful, but at least the city had survived the most dangerous days. With the fire mostly extinguished, the Court of Aldermen moved quickly to begin clearing the streets and helping the city to recover. By the Saturday after the blaze, Moorfields Market was back in operation, offering food and supplies to those who had lost everything. Life slowly and carefully began to return to the city. Charles II, ever mindful of appearances, suggested that the newly homeless might consider trying their luck elsewhere, and issued a royal proclamation encouraging towns and cities across the country to welcome displaced Londoners and allow them to resume their trades. The official account, published in the London Gazette, described the fire as an act of God though rumours of deliberate arson continued to circulate. In the search for someone to blame, authorities focused on Robert Hubert, a French watchmaker who at first confessed being part of a gang that had started the fire in Westminster. Later he claimed he'd acted alone at the bakery on Pudding Lane. Despite doubts about his story, Hubert was found guilty and executed at Tyburn on the 29th of October 1666. It was later revealed that he had been aboard a ship in the North Sea when the fire began, only arriving in London 2 days later, making it highly unlikely that he had anything to do with the blaze. At the same time, a committee chaired by Sir Robert Brooke was established to investigate the origins of the Great Fire. Wild theories abounded, many blaming foreigners or Catholics. When the committee presented its findings to Parliament in January 1667, printed reports confidently declared Hubert guilty, claiming he had acted as part of a Catholic conspiracy, even though evidence suggested he had not been in London at the time. It was a frantic and imperfect attempt to make sense of the disaster, showing that even after the fire had been extinguished, confusion and suspicion still lingered across the city. To prevent London from descending into years of endless disputes and finger-pointing, a special fire court was established. It operated first from February 1667 to December 1668, and then again from 1670 to 1676. Backed by the Fire of London Disputes Act 1666 and the Rebuilding of London Act 1670, the court's task was to determine who should pay for rebuilding: landlords, tenants, or those with the deepest pockets. Cases were handled quickly, often resolved within a single day, helping the city recover at a far faster pace than it might have been otherwise. Charles II, alongside planners and architects such as Christopher Wren, John Evelyn, Robert Hooke, Valentine Knight, and Richard Newcourt, encouraged ambitious schemes for the city's reconstruction. Many proposed neat, orderly grids, a style gaining popularity in cities across the Atlantic. Had any of those grand plans been fully realised, London might have rivaled Paris in Baroque elegance. Wren's designs also suggested separating social classes into different districts, though the challenge of determining land ownership made such ideas difficult to implement. In practice, much of London's old street layout was simply stitched back together. The rebuild did, however, bring welcome improvements. Streets were widened, making room for foot traffic and carriages. The Thames waterfront was cleared of houses, creating open wharves. And most importantly, new buildings were constructed from brick and stone rather than flammable timber. The Rebuilding of London Act of 1666 set clear rules, no wood on the outside, and regulated building costs, workers' wages, and gave property owners 3 years to rebuild or risk losing their land. Funding for this transformation came in part from coal tax, and by 1671 most private homes had been rebuilt, with impressive public buildings rising from the ashes. Among the most striking was the new St Paul's Cathedral, along with 51 new churches, all designed by Wren. Meanwhile, the economist Nicholas Barban took a more adventurous approach, reshaping areas such as the Strand, St Giles, Bloomsbury and Holborn, pushing forward reconstruction with remarkable energy and little concern for rules. Slowly but surely, London began to rise again, phoenix-like, from the ruins of the Great Fire. Incredibly, very few deaths from the fire were officially recorded, just a handful, though it's likely that some went unrecorded amongst all the chaos. Many people may have survived the flames only to struggle afterwards, facing hunger or exposure after losing their homes. Even so, the fire profoundly reshaped London. Around 13,200 houses, 87 churches, and much of the city within the old Roman walls were destroyed, entire neighbourhoods reduced to ash. In a way, it acted as a brutal urban reset. Many of the plague-ridden areas were wiped out, and with them the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in the city. Sanitation improved, simply because much of the accumulated grime and filth had been cleared away. The city was rebuilt under new regulations, though some, like Nicholas Barban, took their own inventive liberties. The fire also prompted more careful mapping and urban planning, as accurate records were needed for reconstruction. Slowly, London began to take on the shape of a modern city. In the end, the Great Fire was undoubtedly catastrophic, but it also sparked a transformation. London emerged stronger, safer, and a little grander, with sturdier buildings, wider streets, fewer fleas, fewer flames, and a lot more bricks. Good night.